Hey, it's Max from UNFTR here for the MeidasTouch Network with some pretty troubling news on the housing front.
We begin in Washington, where President Trump says he will no longer sign a major housing affordability bill into law.
So I'm going to lay the groundwork here with something seemingly unrelated to housing, but it was a stat that caught my attention on social media that I decided to dig into and verify for myself. And it turns out it's deadly accurate. And it gives us a little bit of insight into the bad faith mindset of the GOP and the president. You ready? Let's get after it. All right, so here's what caught my eye the other day. There was a social post that said that there are now more January 6 rioters who have been rearrested for new crimes than proven instances of voter fraud. And why does this matter? Because the reason Donald Trump is trying to kill this bipartisan housing bill, a bill, by the way, which is not a panacea, but it's a start, is because he's using his dwindling political capital to tie the SAVE Act to this housing initiative. Now, the SAVE Act is the GOP's racist bill that purports to crack down on voter fraud, but it's really just a mechanism to disenfranchise voters. And we could talk about that another day, but here's the salient math. Remember the Heritage Foundation, the conservative think tank responsible for Project 2025? They've been tracking instances of voter fraud for the past 9 years. It is a huge effort, and you can look it up on their website. I'll leave a link to it in the description. The average instances, according to this extremely conservative outlet, the average instances of fraud each year is 130 nationwide. So out of 150 million votes that were cast in 2024, let's say, 130 of them, not 130 million, 130 were potentially fraudulent. And as of June, 132 January 6 rioters who were convicted have been rearrested. Gun charges and DUIs, assault, stabbing, domestic violence, child pornography, and on and on. I'll leave that link in the description as well. So why this math? Because we have a legit housing crisis, and the 21st Century Road to Housing Act, it's a start. It's a pure capitalist stopgap that really doesn't address the core need or the need to completely reimagine public housing in major urban areas, along with massive investments into things like transit infrastructure. But it's a start. The 21st Century Housing Act attempts to increase the U.S. housing supply by reducing construction costs, getting corporations out of the single-family home market, and by streamlining regulations and codes. Fine. Of course, Mike Little Johnson took the news of the president's latest knife in the back of the American citizen struggling to afford a house pretty much in stride, running cover for his owner like a good little puppy.
President believes in election integrity. He talks about it all the time, and we do as well. In act and deed, we have stood for that. We passed the Save America Act again. Here's this. Let me finish this. This is very important. That is the top priority, because if you do not have safe elections in this grand experiment in self-governance that we have in a constitutional republic, you don't have anything.
It's a complete misdirect, obviously. To say that election integrity supersedes housing supply is a fine talking point if you're in a banana republic that doesn't run free and fair elections, maybe, but we don't have fraudulent elections. End of story. But we do have a housing problem. So let's really dive into that, because there was some pretty rough data that came out over just the past week. Something that I just covered on UNFTR this week was housing starts, and we'll go through the numbers quickly before we get to some brand new information that just came out a couple days ago. The May housing starts fell 15.4%. That's the lowest reading since COVID, and it missed Wall Street consensus by 230,000 units. That's huge. Now, the headline number is bad enough, but the real story is what happened in multifamily construction. That's buildings with 5 or more units. These are the apartment towers and the mid-rises. Multifamily starts, developments that were supposed to be the supply side answer to the nation's housing crisis, fell 40% in a single month. That's the steepest monthly drop since April of 2009, smack dab in the middle of the great financial crisis. So rates and high valuations affect demand negatively for obvious reasons. And one of the reasons that building might be holding off right now is still because of tariffs. See, the Trump administration's tariff regime layered cost pressures over the past, 12 to 15 months onto an industry that was already stretched thin. So like softwood lumber carries a 10% tariff. Kitchen cabinets and vanities, 25%, and they're slated to climb to 50% if he gets his way. Steel and aluminum tariffs hit structural components throughout the entire build. So last year, the National Association of Home Builders estimated that these costs added $10,900 to the price of every new home. And even though many of these tariffs expired, they're being re-upped through the temporary IEPA powers of the executive. So it's difficult to parse how much is impacting supply on a monthly basis, but it's chilling the market. And I've said before, we should be wary of any single month data points, but these figures are catastrophic, enough so that it made me dig even deeper as I was waiting for the new home sales release this week. And I have to say, it's really difficult to tease out any silver linings in the housing market right now. And what makes it all the more maddening is that literally one guy is standing in the way of doing the bare minimum to tackle the problem. All right, so let's talk about some cost drivers here. And we'll start with mortgage rates, which are hovering around 6.5% on the 30-year right now. One of the things that I hear from my older audience members who are maybe longtime home buyers who have a lot of equity in their homes and are still sitting on that equity is that I don't know what everybody's complaining about. 6.5% is nothing. You should have seen what it was in the 1980s. And they're not wrong technically. In the early 80s, the number was pushing 18%. So again, technically, I guess it could be worse. But that framing almost completely misses the point. Rates are not the problem in isolation. The problem is rates plus prices. The median existing home price in this country is $429,000. Again, as of May, that's an all-time high for that month. So the national median family income, though, sits at $106,000. So if you're a first-time buyer with 20% down at today's rate, you're looking at a monthly payment of $2,100. That's before property taxes, before insurance, or a single repair. You're consuming almost a quarter of your gross monthly income before you've eaten dinner. And that's assuming you've saved enough for that big down payment. So remember when Trump promised that he'd get his guy into the Fed and rates would collapse and mortgage payments would fall through the floor? Well, his guy's there. Kevin Warsh is running the show now. And the committee just held rates firm while signaling that they might actually be looking to hike them. The whole thing's kind of poetic, isn't it? But here's the thing, and this is what drives me crazy when I hear politicians and commentators and pundits talk about the Fed as the housing cure. The Fed doesn't set the mortgage rates, not directly at least. The 30-year fixed tracks the 10-year Treasury yield, and the 10-year is stubbornly high because the bond market is essentially betting against the country's trajectory because Trump's in charge. So when a mortgage bank prices a loan, they're looking at the 10-year, but then they're looking at the creditworthiness of the buying pool. So you've got a market that doesn't trust the fiscal direction of this administration, layered onto consumers who are increasingly stretched. That's why rates are where they are. So Trump trying to lower the Fed funds rate by a quarter point isn't going to move the needle. Again, this is all a misdirect. And the clearest evidence of what all of this means for, actual human beings came out this week in the new sales numbers. And it's not pretty. Sales of new single-family homes in May fell 7.3% to a seasonally adjusted annual rate of 580,000, which missed every single economist estimate in the entire Bloomberg survey, every single one. And understand that builders have been cutting prices and offering incentives, buying down mortgages just to try and move inventory, and people still aren't biting. Like out west, they saw a 27% collapse in sales in a single month. Down south, which is the biggest home building region in the country, they dropped to 350,000 units. That's the lowest in 7 years. The for sale supply of new homes is sitting at 10 months of supply. And you want to know the last time it was that high? 2009, again, right in the middle of the financial crisis. So builders are slowing construction to drain the spec home inventory, which is homes built without a buyer under contract, because they genuinely don't know when demand will come back. And this is what happens when you run housing as a market. When the market gets scared, it stops building. And the people who needed homes yesterday still need homes today. So here's another number that I want you to think about. Right now, roughly 10% of America's housing inventory is vacant. 15 million homes, 1 in 10, empty. So that's rental units, spec homes, second properties, investment properties, and so on. So we're not short on structures. We're short on structures that are priced and located where people want to live and where they can afford them, right? So while these units sit empty and builders are slowing starts to protect their profit margins and hedge funds still sit on inventory of single-family homes because the new law hasn't taken effect yet, 745,000 Americans were without shelter on a single night in January 2025. This is the HUD point-in-time count, a methodology where on one specific night, volunteers go out and count every person sleeping in an emergency shelter, transitional housing program, a car, an encampment, the street. This is a massive, massive national effort conducted by nonprofits. It is heroic work. And that's just month one of Trump 2.0. So one can only imagine what that looks like today. Now, a quick word on the methodology here, because I really think the homeless piece of this is really important. The point-in-time count doesn't capture people who are doubled up with family, let's say, or still living in their parents' basement in their 30s, or couch surfing, staying somewhere temporarily and unstably. So this is a floor, not a ceiling. The actual number of people who are experiencing homelessness in any given year is multiples higher. But even by HUD's most conservative single night measure, we're still talking about 750,000 people without a roof over their heads. And a lot of them, like a scary amount, are children. And a word to all of the Republicans and even some of the centrist Democrats that made immigration the focal point of both the housing and the homelessness crisis. Understand something. The unhoused number is down about 25,000 from the prior year because we added more temporary beds under Biden. And the number of vacant homes, pretty much unchanged. So it was never about immigration, but you knew that, didn't you? See, and this is the core of the dysfunction, that we have a 10% vacancy rate of all of our housing inventory, but still 750,000 people on the street at the same time. These two facts should be morally incompatible in a functioning society, but they're not incompatible in a market. In a market, it's perfectly coherent because the people who need the vacant units can't afford them. So those units serve no market purpose, and the market doesn't build or allocate towards solving the problem. So it's not a market failure. That's the market working exactly as it's designed, which means you need to fundamentally alter everything related to housing. All right, so let's talk about an affordability trap that doesn't get enough attention because it's one that squeezes from both ends. Those older homeowners that we talked about are sitting on historic equity. The appreciation of residential real estate over the last 15 years has been extraordinary. So for the people who bought in the 90s or the early 2000s or even before that, their home is the core of their net worth, which sounds like a win, and in a narrow sense it is. But the problem is they too are locked in because they can't afford to sell at a discount because every dollar of inflation that they've weathered from groceries and healthcare and utilities has eaten into their liquidity. So their equity is stuck in the house. And so they hold. And they don't trade down. They don't lower the prices fast enough to keep up with demand. They don't free up the inventory. They just sit. And as they sit, the new starts collapsing and the entry-level supply starts shrinking and the younger buyers being priced out of the very thing that's supposed to be the cornerstone of the American middle-class wealth-building dream. It's why the median age of the first-time home buyer hit a record of 40 years old, which was up from the 30s just a decade ago. So people aren't choosing to wait longer, they're being forced to wait longer. And when they finally get in, or they try to, the numbers show that when they're successful, many of them are now struggling. Mortgage delinquencies rose to 4.4% in the first quarter of this year. And FHA loans, which is a product specifically designed for first-time and lower-income buyers, hit nearly 12% delinquency rate. So wages aren't keeping pace, and the tariff-driven price pressure is hitting construction materials and consumer goods simultaneously. And now, this is the part that genuinely doesn't get talked about enough. The cost shift from the federal government to the states is adding a new tax burden on homeowners in ways that don't yet show up in the housing data directly. See, when you gut federal aid to states through Medicaid and education, housing assistance. The states have to pick up the slack somehow. It's just a burden shift. That means that higher state and local taxes or reduced services or both kick in. In high-cost housing markets, property taxes are already brutal. I'm on Long Island. Trust me, it is a major event and a huge part of everyone's income. Pile on any additional state-level fiscal pressures, and you're adding to the total cost of ownership in ways that don't show up in a mortgage payment, but are absolutely felt in the pocketbook. And then there's insurance. Something nobody was really talking about 5-10 years ago has grown into a full-blown crisis. In coastal states and wildfire corridors and flood-prone regions, the private insurance market is literally pulling out. So after the LA wildfires damaged or destroyed more than 18,000 properties, California's largest private insurers stopped renewing policies, and they pushed people into the state's FAIR plan. That's the insurer of last resort, which is now itself under strain from liquidity challenges. So since the mid-2010s, U.S. insurers have experienced more financially damaging years than profitable ones in the homeowner market. And the retreat isn't limited to obvious danger zones. Premiums have spiked by up to 50%. I can attest to that personally. Coverage has been reduced or eliminated in places like Iowa and Arkansas and Utah, which is not exactly your first guess for, let's say, climate risk hotspots. And here's why all of that matters to housing specifically. You can't get a traditional mortgage without it. So in an increasing number of markets, the inability to obtain affordable coverage isn't just an inconvenience, it's a barrier to actually purchasing a home. So the market is closing off from the bottom while asset holders sit tight at top. That's the big squeeze. So now let me bring this full circle, because we started with a math problem and I want to end with one too. The one piece of broadly supported bipartisan legislation designed to put a small dent in the problem is being held hostage because Donald Trump wants to attach a voter suppression bill to it. A bill designed to address a problem that, by a conservative foundation's own 9-year painstaking account, affects 130 people out of 150 million voters. 130 people, period. While 745,000 people sleep outside. That's bad math. Focusing your energy on 130 people instead of 745,000 people without a roof is a system failure. And look, I've said before, the 21st Century Road to Housing Act is no panacea. It's just a beginning of something to try and coerce the market into increasing supply. It doesn't address public housing, transit-oriented development, transit infrastructure itself, nothing that would fundamentally alter the game. And it certainly doesn't untangle the insurance crisis or the delinquency spiral or the structural gap between where housing supply exists and people want to live. So it's just a heavily compromised, politically negotiated start. And it very likely still has a path to becoming law, by the way. So if Congress is in session and the president does nothing for 10 days after the bill is formally presented, it generally becomes law anyway. So this isn't necessarily over. But what this moment tells you, what it really says, is the fundamental bad faith at the heart of how this administration views housing as an issue. They don't. They view it as leverage. For the MeidasTouch Network, I'm Max from UNFTR. You can find me on YouTube and Blue Sky at UNFTR. And don't forget to sign up for our free weekly newsletter at UNFTR.com. I'll catch you online.
Want to stay plugged in? Become a subscriber to our Substack at MeidasPlus.com. You'll get daily recaps from Ron Filipkowski, ad-free episodes of our podcast, and more exclusive content only available at MeidasPlus.com.